Hi, this is Alessio. Hope you're well. Recently, I spoke with the brilliant analyst and economist Lyn Alden, and I asked her a very important question, which is what is the biggest risk that is facing Bitcoin right now fundamentally? So guys, this is not about charts. This is truly about the fundamentals of Bitcoin. I want to ask, what is the biggest risk right now that is facing Bitcoin, not just in the short term, but actually the long term as well? All right, guys, join me. So Lyn, I have a question for you. Now, I apologize beforehand because it's going to sound silly, and I apologize to our viewers because it may come out like some people might think I'm a no-coiner or that I don't believe in Bitcoin for some reason that I'm even asking this question. But I think it is important because there are some people out there who believe that if a new technology, a superior technology comes along in 10, 15 years that is superior to Bitcoin, that potentially Bitcoin can go to zero, the price of Bitcoin can go to zero. And I mention this because an interesting thing you mentioned in, I'll just read this, in one of the interviews you did. I just want to read something you said, which is fascinating. You said, money is a kind of technology. If it comes into contact with a culture that has better technology, they can undermine your money. So I want to address that with Bitcoin. So what if, for example, something like that happens with Bitcoin? Let's say 10, 15 years, and more superior technology comes along that is just more efficient, let's say, at what Bitcoin does, similar to what Bitcoin does, just better. What do you think about that? Could that have a negative impact on Bitcoin and maybe replace it and maybe drive the Bitcoin price to zero? I know it's speculation, but I'm interested to hear your view about it.
I think it's a reasonable question. It's a good way to approach it. And I think answering that question, you have to kind of dive into the different trade-offs that cryptocurrencies make in their design process. And so, since Bitcoin was developed, we've had now about 20,000 cryptocurrencies that come up with different variables for how they want to compete with Bitcoin. And a lot of them market themselves as better technology than Bitcoin.
Mm,
But what they're really doing is they're making trade-offs, right? So they're
yeah,
basically usually what they're doing is sacrificing some degree of decentralization in order to be faster or more expressive or some other variable, and then they're marketing that as though it's an improvement when in reality it's a trade-off. And I think what makes Bitcoin kind of different from others and valuable in an interesting way is that it's by far in most metrics of looking at it the most decentralized. And so they purposely have small block space and pretty slow settlement times for the main network. And that's in order to have it so that it's very easy to run a node and to audit the entire network. And that makes it so that there's a ton of nodes. There's tens of thousands of nodes on the network. And so there's no ability for any sort of central area or central entity to push updates onto the network. And so I think this is basically it's the most immutable, the most kind of decentralized one. And there's actually a pretty limited design space around money. And there's actually, Dr. Adam Back, who he's the inventor of Hashcash, which is basically the proof of work algorithm that Bitcoin eventually used. He was cited in the Bitcoin white paper, even though he didn't invent it. He invented a piece of technology that Satoshi ultimately used for it, and he later became a developer in the Bitcoin space and is the CEO of Blockstream. He described how in 2013 he's an expert in applied cryptography. He's one of the leading experts on this. He sits down and he's like, okay, I got to figure out how to improve this thing. There must be trade-offs we can do. And he quickly found out that any variable he would theoretically tweak would make it worse in some other area. Basically, that the technology was already rather well optimized, and it's a surprisingly limited design space. And so I think that as long as people understand what the trade-offs are, they should always be on the lookout for better technology, but then I think be aware that when you have a protocol level technology, kind of a network effect of this size, it's actually quite hard to come up with something that is dramatically better, because it's very unlikely to be strictly better, and instead is making some sort of trade-off that in many cases will reduce its decentralization. Another analogy I would use is, the way that the internet works, TCP/IP, or even Ethernet, right? These are protocols that have been around for roughly 50 years. And we know they're going to be around for another 20, 25, 30, who knows how far they're going to go. But it's not like these are, when you have a foundation for something that significant, generally that's not as this rapidly changing protocol. You usually have layers on top of it that might radically update, but that the underlying system is rather stable. And
I see.
and if anything, they do change. I mean, there are upgrades to Ethernet, there are upgrades to USB, there are upgrades to TCP/IP, but they end up being these backwards compatible rolling upgrades. And so, for example, Bitcoin does have upgrades over time. They've done SegWit, they've done Taproot, they've done these kind of backwards compatible soft upgrades so that it gets better over time. So I do think you have to kind of look out for better technology, but I think that in order to judge what is better technology, you have to put a lot of time into understanding all the different trade-offs, especially around decentralization, managing
Yeah,
bandwidth, managing storage that all these different cryptocurrencies make.
that's a very interesting answer. Thanks, Lyn. I appreciate that. So is it your view that it's unlikely that such a technology would come along, or it's a possibility, but just not very likely?
I think it's
Same.
possible but unlikely, and it's something
Hmm.
I analyze and think about. I think that once you have a major network effect, any sort of new technologies that kind of pop up in the space could be
Mm.
put on Bitcoin, and in some cases already have been, right? So technology
Mm.
can actually flow from some kind of novel new technology and kind of wind up on the the major network of the space. And so I think it's somewhat unlikely to have something come along that is just so much better than Bitcoin that Bitcoin can't handle. But I think people should be open-minded when they analyze the space
Yeah.
and they're kind of looking out for development of what's happening. And I think just be aware of any sort of trade-offs that anything makes when they claim to be better than Bitcoin or a technological leap over Bitcoin, because 99 times out of 100, what they're doing is they're making some really big sacrifice somewhere else in order to kind of have other variables that are better, but then they end up usually sacrificing decentralization.
I absolutely agree with you. I think, yeah, having read your article, when you actually explain these points, I think I can see where you're coming from. By the way, guys, please do check out Lyn's premium newsletter. I think it's definitely worth, checking out the subscription. Please go to lynalden.com/premium, and you can find out all the details about her premium subscription. And definitely, please do subscribe. I think it's really worth it. Can you just explain briefly what people can get in your premium subscription, as well as your free newsletter?
Sure, happy to. So I kind of do three types of material on my website. So one is I put out a couple, these long-term pieces that focus on evergreen types of content. So I explore a subject and kind of write about it. The other thing I do is I have a public newsletter that comes out every 6 weeks on average, and that gets a little bit more tactical and time sensitive and focuses on what's happening with markets, what is the macro outlook at this current time. And then my that's the majority of my content. But then I have a fairly low cost research service that comes out every 2 weeks, and that's even more tactical. And that's kind of diving into okay, what's happening in markets, across treasuries, gold, credit markets, stock market, global markets, digital assets. What's happening, all these different ecosystems. What's of interest, and then I often dive into a specific company or a specific industry as like an opportunity. And so that's kind of my most frequent level of update where I'm sharing what I'm investing in, and I'm kind of focusing on all these different things that are happening in the world.
Lyn, thanks very much. And you've been a wonderful guest, and you've been one of the most interesting people I've talked to, certainly in these interviews. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.